Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce. That was the cherubic hymn that called the Hymn of the Cherubim. Beautifully done. That one was in Latin. It is a very much Eastern practice, especially around the liturgy. The laity comes in and typically chants, "Let us who mystically represent the cherubim," and sing the thrice holy hymn to the life-giving Trinity. Lay aside all worldly cares that we may receive the King of all, invisibly escorted by the angelic host. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. One of my favorite sections of the Eastern liturgy. Well, today we're doing an interesting episode, one that's a little bit odd, but it is in history and we can't ignore it. Imagine you're in the year 897. The Pope at the time in Rome ordered that his predecessor's corpse be dug up out of the ground, dress him up, put him in his papal robes, and sits him on a throne and puts him in a trial in front of everybody and all the church leaders. And he starts condemning him. This event that I'm referring to is known as the Cadaver Synod. And what I want to talk about is, why would that happen? How could that happen? And can that happen again today? So that'll be a part of our discussion in this episode. The Pope that I'm referring to that was put to the trial, who had died 9 months prior to this, his name is Pope Formosus. Formosus and Stephen VI are the conflict here. Formosus was dead. His next predecessor lived just a few days into his papacy and died. And then Stephen VI becomes the next pope. There's a massive political chasm going on between two camps. Really, what it shows to us today is that political interests and really division has always been a part of major schism and even creating problems for the church inside and out. So especially during this period of time, you understand we're talking about the Middle Ages. We're talking about a lot of politics. We'll get into what happened just about 100 years prior to this. It started changing the trajectory of even the papacy. Rome and many of its scholars today even look at that period of time and admit that the papacy became a very political stage. It became a very political driven movement of leaders, and that people were put into power that were just straight evil. There wasn't really a spiritual bone in many of their bodies. People ask me all the time on this program, do you think all popes are in heaven? Well, no, I don't. I don't even know many Catholic scholars who would believe that. They would say it's entirely possible there's various popes who are in hell today, and it wouldn't surprise any of us. In addition to the many of the anti-popes that have come into the history of the church as well. So looking at this, I mean, even historical records, Annales writes about this event in 897. He says, and thereafter, Stephen VI put Pope Formosus out of his tomb. Now, he's dead. He's just quietly living in his beatific vision, perhaps, if he was a good godly pope. If not, maybe he was in a purgatorial state. His body is resting, and Stephen VI takes him out of his resting place, puts him on the apostolic throne, puts him in his apostolic vestments, strips him of it at the end of this, throws his body into the river, cuts off the 3 fingers that blessed during his papacy, call all of his ordinations, all of his works null and void. So what would actually drive a pope in Rome to do something of such magnitude and madness? Like, was it just revenge? Or is there actually something going on in this section of history that is much, much deeper? So let's talk about the empire that's going on behind this. So remember, after the fall of Charlemagne, Europe is splintered into massive competing kingdoms. And now this is going to be very, very important, because after the year 888, Regino of Prom wrote this: each decided to create a king from his own guts. None so outshone the other that the rest designed to submit. And what he means by that is people just started creating their own leaders. They chose who they wanted. They started putting kings and princes and all their leaders the way they wanted them and when they wanted them. It was really a dog eat dog kind of empire in Europe going across these different countries. Now, the papacy, on the other hand, though it is empowered by imperial alliances, and we've kind of talked about that on the program with Pat and I. If you've missed any of those, we're 2 parts into a 7-part series on the ecumenical councils. We discuss even how important it is to understand political landscapes and imperial works going on into some of the major ecumenical councils. So if you missed any of those, please go back and listen to that. Also, if you're with us for the first time, thank you for joining this podcast. Thank you for joining this really live stream. If you're listening in the comments right now, make sure you hit the like on this video. If you're not subscribed yet, make sure you hit the subscribe there. If you're listening on the podcast, please make sure you hit the notification and the follow buttons so that way new episodes are released, you are immediately notified, just like this episode. So just talking about it from the perspective of the papacy, it is clearly empowered by imperial alliances. And now in this situation, when Europe has gone absolutely mad, the papacy is trapped between different rival powers. And one of the things that typically happens is that a pope is going to kind of be in favor of one family over against the other. Now, one of the things that needs to be stated in this is when you're looking at the pope, sometimes the imperial pressure moved a certain candidate. Now, today, when people are selected, like Pope Leo XIV was just done recently, it's the cardinals. They come together and then they meet until they elect their next pope. On the other hand, at this time, even if there's involvement of other religious leaders, the major political figures had lots of money and influence into decision making. Again, I don't think anyone, even in the Roman Catholic historian categories, would deny major influences that were going on and that the papacy became a political thing, not a spiritual. It doesn't mean that all the popes at that time were not spiritual, but to leave out the political element would be a little bit delusional. Now, the crisis continues because the papal throne changed almost on a yearly basis. As I stated, even if you're looking at this situation with Formosus, he died. His next successor lasted all of about 15 days, died. Stephen VI comes in. He's a pope just over a year and a half. We'll talk what happens to him. There seems to be a regular change and transition almost on a yearly basis from the year 896 all the way to 904. A new pope is put into power through these few years. It's incredible how many of them just got knocked off, died of natural causes, or they were just killed. And so this becomes a major transitional point because the papacy had no consistency for almost 10 years between political transitions. Now, that instability in of itself created more corruption and division and violence because every time somebody got into power, that pope died or was killed, the next power came in and they had their finale for a while and their celebratory victories only to be conquered and then back and forth it went. So the papacy's power to the crown becomes important here because papal figures are now crowning emperors. And now it's not just that there's a separation between these political powers and the papacy. It's the papacy is creating the political powers, which in turn now bless and fund and bring money in order to bring unity between state and church, if you would. So it's kind of like, let's scratch each other's back kind of situation. Now, every single time the Pope would ordain or to anoint a king in one of these European areas, specifically in Rome or in these different regions, it created factions. It created division and more schism because nobody wanted that. You didn't pick my favorite leader, or you picked the wrong guy. And then it became a major conflict even for the church. So let's talk about our man who was put on trial. Let's talk about Pope Formosus. Who is he? Whatever happened? Like, what was the major issue with him? Well, early in his life, he was the Bishop of Portus. He was known as being an extremely skilled diplomat. He was a missionary to Bulgaria. He was known for being very courteous to the poor and the outcast. His desire was really to see unity in the church as an overall theme for his life. But his influence also created major rivals. In the end of the day, he also saw a lot of conflict and people that opposed him. He was accused of having too much ambition, that he was overly zealous, and that he was actually plotting to take over the papacy. That when he became pope, it's because he was doing the work behind the scenes long before he was given the opportunity. And so he's going to be later accused of seizing the papacy and actually conspiring to take the papacy. Now, he was excommunicated by Pope John VIII, but later reinstated. And so we'll see a little bit of conflict about his excommunications and then reinstatements, not just during his life. I'm talking about after he died as well. This becomes really, really important. Now, he's pope for about 5 years, between the year 891 and 896. Now, he had the support of Arnulf of Carinthia over the Spalatin family. Now, remember, you got two major powers of families. You have the Arnulf, and then you also have Spalatin. These are major family rivals, and they're going to support their candidates for pope, and then they'll be anointed by that pope. Well, naturally, Arnulf got his guy, and he was blessed and received into this. So Pope Formosus is now pope for 5 years. He crowns Arnulf the Roman emperor around the year 896. Now, this is really, really important. It's the beginning of the year in February. He now gives him the anointing process because, the right hand is, pleased, and now shakes the other hand over here. And now we have a team. But here's the problem. Even though Arnulf is the now Holy Roman Emperor, just a few weeks after he is instated as the emperor, Pope Formosus dies. Some believe he died possibly of a stroke. Now, that leaves his enemies in control. So the irony here is something that you would read in a novel or see in some crazy movie or show, like the plot thickens as this goes through. So there becomes an interesting point because now other spiritual and religious leaders in Rome have their ability to slip in a new pope, even against the empirical rule of Arnulf that they don't want. So again, a favor led to a favor, but one of those favors died just after. So what ends up happening, well, again, we don't know everything. We don't know how he died. Some say a stroke, or some say maybe a heart attack, or we really don't know, but he died just a few weeks after. Now, this becomes interesting. Arnulf suffered a stroke, withdrew from Italy. So the Pope dies. The emperor gets an illness. He suffers from a stroke. And he leaves the country. Now, how weird is that? So the Spalatin family, the Spalatin faction, regains Rome. Now, Stephen VI becomes pope, but he was actually a sympathizer to the Arnulf situation. But hey, you got to play politics. Arnulf had a stroke, fled Italy. His rival is now in charge. He's got the keys to all of the power and money in Rome. And you're next in line in popularity contest to be the Pope. Now, obviously, his name becomes Stephen VI. But at this time, he ends up coming into the situation. And then guess what he did? He sucked up to the right people. He played the political game. And now he is made Pope. And now he has to please the powers to be. So it is believed that, maybe politically motivated, he actually has Formosus's body, his corpse, taken out of his tomb that had been dead for 9 whole months, and staged one of history's most grotesque trials that we've ever seen in church history. One that Rome would certainly love not to have in their history books. So what ends up happening then? Well, this takes place in the Basilica of St. John the Lateran around January 897. Now remember, this is about a year later from everything that happened. His decaying body, dressed in his papal vestments, put on a throne. Obviously, he can't speak for himself, so there has to be a spokesperson on his behalf. Well, guess what they did? They appointed a deacon to defend the corpse. Now, how would you like to be the deacon in this situation? Like, I look at this and I think about the deacon all the time when I'm studying this concept. You got this dead corpse. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what kind of stench was in the room. I don't know what level of decomposing had happened to the body here, but here's a deacon who probably had to stand relatively close to this dead corpse, who is just Pope 9 months prior. And here's accusations coming, and he's having to come up with a defense on behalf of a dead Pope. I mean, can you imagine how awkward this must have been for this deacon? So he's appointed. Now, Stephen VI is accused of screaming these words. When you were Pope, or when you were Bishop of Porto, why did you usurp the universal Roman See in such a spirit of ambition? So when you were the Bishop of Porto, basically, why did you take the papal throne? Why did you go in and steal the office of papacy? Who gave you the right to do that? Here's the problem. We don't know if that ever happened. In fact, it's very unlikely. We don't know exactly how he got in there. Now, I'm sure, just like Stephen VI, that it wasn't because he was a super spiritual guy and that spiritual people came together and heard the Spirit of God working in the midst of their group and they appointed the next Pope. It was as politically motivated for Formosus as it was for Stephen VI. So the charges are brought before him. Here are the charges. Transmigration of seas. This is where they get nitpicky, right? Like, I mean, if you've got to make a nice statement for the new emperor, and you've got to be supported by him. So you've got to put something out there that's going to wow everybody. Well, here's your wow factor. And so what you also have to do is you also have to pick the smallest, dumbest things that are technically incorrect, not right. And you've got to highlight them and make them bigger than they were. And one of the things they accuse him of doing is serving as a bishop of more than one diocese, which is still a no-no. I've never understood, there's things like this that happen today. I happen to know of Anglican dioceses that have a bishop serving 2 different dioceses. It's problematic. I think it's a bad idea. It is historically never been practiced. Here's an example of it. Now, here's the thing. These charges that are being brought, there's a lot of gray area here to the accusations, like partial truths, but not fully the whole story and things like that. So charge number 1, you are the bishop of more than one diocese. Therefore, your papacy is invalid. Number 2, perjury and violating an oath to remain a layman. Now, we don't have a lot of criteria behind this, and we don't exactly know what's going to happen and what happened in this situation. But they're basically saying he lied, took an oath to remain a layman, and he did not, and he broke an oath. So he's an oath breaker. He's a liar. He's a conspirator. He's a liar. and he breaks rules. He's a rule breaker. I mean, that's what they come up with. And then the third charge was that he illegally assumed the office of papacy through improper means, that he had plotted to do this. Again, so you break this down. He breaks the laws of the church. He's a liar, breaks oaths, he's an oath breaker, and he is a conspirator. That's the accusation. Now, of course, I can only imagine what that poor deacon, who's also under political pressure, who's supposed to come up with responses for this, because this is a fair trial, of course. And in a fair trial, I mean, you got to give yourself a fair hearing. I mean, there has to be a defense. There has to be a statement of response. This poor deacon, who is probably scared for his life that he too would suffer some sort of execution had he went too far to try to defend Formosus. And so I'm imagining that he was probably very, very careful and calculated with his words to defend Formosus. And in fact, he probably said enough things to be damned. Like threw in an intentional, like, oops, sorry. Oh, did I just admit that? My bad. I don't know how it went. I don't think any of us know how it went, but I can't imagine that the defense was very good. This poor deacon was thrown into a no-win situation. Verdict, what did the court decide? Well, guilty, of course. He was found guilty of all three charges. His vestments are stripped. His blessing fingers are cut off. His papacy is nullified. His ordinations are nullified. His work, his research is nullified. And his body is thrown into the Tiber River, which was later recovered by monks. And they reported that miracles actually started happening from the body of Formosus, which, again, may just be legend and myth. We don't know, but that's the reports from the story, is that once they pulled his corpse from the Tiber, miracles started happening from his dead corpse. Maybe the case. So how do we look at this madness, this craziness? How do we interpret it traditionally? How do we look at it even from a modern worldview, right? So let's talk about it from a couple standpoints. Let's look at the traditional view. For a long time, the historians blamed a lot of people for this. They say that it was political revenge. They say that it was just appealing to the powers to be to appease them and make them happy, for choosing one person and anointing another. We really don't know, because no one in that time, in that time period, actually ties events together. They just kind of report the news of what happened and kind of leave us to guess. Given the period of time and all the things that have transpired around that time, I'm going to land with that this was some sort of political appeasement more than political revenge. You got to suck up to the boss, right? And popes are making emperors, but emperors are funding popes. Even if you don't like each other, you're going to have to do something to let the other believe, I'm on your side. Like, I've got your back. So I don't know if it was political revenge from the family feuds and the rivals of powers in Rome before, as much as I'm going to suck up to my boss and make sure I'm not going to get killed, or I'm not going to get conspired against by others. That would be the case. Now, there's been reassessments of this. I mean, you got guys like William Monroe, who have been a big part of this, and his assessments are things like this. Stephen VI was acting out of political desperation, which I just stated and I agree with. Not really coercion or any kind of like conspiracy. It's just, I'm under pressure and I need to do something about it. Again, as I stated earlier, Stephen VI, he was actually not in favor of the family that became in power. His goal was not to do that at all. He was actually for Arnulf. He was interested in that family actually staying in power. It wasn't until the Spalatin family came in. He wasn't really a fan of them, but hey, what are you going to do? Well, desperation says do something drastic. Well, he did one of the most drastic things that's ever been done by a pope. And he'll be remembered for it, not in a positive way. So he's trying to make the Spalatins happy. He's trying to make them considering his papacy as valid, good, and useful. That's what I think is happening here. But Monroe would go so far as to say that even going beyond the political realm here, that there's actually an attack of sanctity that's going on too. And that could be a sick, twisted plot in and of itself. Like, well, what was he seeking to do here, even on a spiritual level, not just a political level, because it overlapped and created a problem even for the process of the papacy moving forward. So let's talk about the backlash and the problems that come from a trial like this. The synod itself created much discussion. The faithful Catholics at the time were not happy. I mean, you can imagine the people weren't sitting there going, oh, yeah, sure, let's unbury a dead pope that's been rotting for 9 months, put him in his papal vestments, throw a welcome party back to his throne to condemn him on 3 accounts, and then throw his body in the Tiber River. Yeah, the people weren't very happy about this, and rightfully so. So let's talk about it from the perspective of what ends up coming from this. The people are mad. Rome thinks this is disgusting. Stephen VI was deposed. I mean, I know he went for drama, but he crossed a line at the end of the day. He's put in prison. He's put into a tower. And within a few months, he's strangled to death and killed. So a pope condemns a predecessor, brings him in, tries his dead corpse, condemns him, cuts off his blessing fingers, throws him in the Tiber. He's then taken over by mobs, deposed of his position by the very people he's trying to please. Apparently it didn't work. He's thrown into prison, into a tower, and in the 9th hour, apparently, somebody shows up, strangles him to death, kills Pope Stephen VI. Pretty crazy. We don't know who killed Stephen VI. We know why they killed him. And it's clearly going to be a politically motivated death, because they have to replace him. Well, who replaces him? Well, in the year 897, Pope Theodore II comes in and tries to clean up the mess. He annuls the trial and says that the synod is completely void, empty, and null. He takes Formosus's body and he makes sure it's reburied in St. Peter's Basilica. Not a bad move. Now, remember, Pope Theodore II only lasts about a year himself. So in 898, Pope John IX confirmed this and really put a forbidden sign on any kind of future trials of corpses. Smart move. Now, you're going to think this is crazy, but here's how it goes. Formosus is tried, his dead body is tried by Stephen VI. Stephen VI is then killed. Theodore II absolutely revokes all of this and says it can't happen. His trial and nullification by other predecessors say, no, actually it was a valid trial. So the Cadaver Synod is good to go, like it wasn't bad. And then another pope has to come in and undo that one. Popes are undoing popes, who undid popes, who undid popes. John IX says, no corpse trials anymore. Enough. That'll never happen again. So the question that was asked, I think even early on in the audience, was, can something like this ever happen again? So it was like, does that mean like Pope Francis could be tried? No. No. There is no dead corpse trials allowed anymore, thanks to the Cadaver Synod. Thanks to what happened here, that can never happen again. So even Lambert approved the annulment of all this. So there is a complete removal and said, nope, it was never valid. Everything that was done there, the damnation, the removal of ordinations, Formosus and his papacy is valid. That was not nullified. So you had to nullify a nullification. That got annulled and then nulled again. And at this point, I think I'm making words up. This is a mess. The 10th century then becomes known as the Dark Age of the papacy. Rome dominated by families rather than by the Spirit of God, which comes from power, money, bribery, violence, and acts of war. It took men and popes like Leo IX and Gregory VII to start seeing actual moral values come back into the position of the papacy. Listen, the Leos were great. I mean, all the way back from Leo to the Great forward, Leo IX, going into Leo XIII. The book is open with blank pages for Leo XIV to put his name in it. And honestly, some of the things that he has said as of recent has been a little bit alarming for people like myself. But maybe the Lord will do something great through Leo XIV. But really, the political dark age of the papacy, especially in the 10th century, 9th into the 10th century, was just damning. I mean, again, I would not be the least bit surprised to get into eternity and see a lot of the popes in that era who hear the words, I never knew you, depart from me, you who work iniquity. It would not shock me at all. But there were good popes, very good popes that came before and after. Like I said, Gregory VII really brought moral value back to the church. Leo IX very much tried to see that the office was always meant to be spiritual and led by the Spirit, not by political power, corruption, and money. So, like, what do we take away from a trial like this? What do we take away from the Cadaver Synod when a dead pope stands trial? Like, what should we look at today and say, how should I view history in that manner? How should I look at the church in such a way? And by the way, for those that want to come in and just like blast the Roman Catholic Church and act like things like this never happened in the patriarchal works of the East, or looking at some of the traditions that have happened even in the Church of England, for example, putting people to death and corruption of the archbishopric in Canterbury and things. I mean, come on. Many of which of Anglicanism's formation started with political motivated decisions to kill people and to remove and set up their own church. I mean, that's a big way that the Catholic Church and the English Church split. Major splits. So we need to at least view this and not go, well, I mean, good grief, Rome has once again proven that the papacy is bad. No, what that means is that the papacy had bad popes and that God brought a lot of judgment on the church. A lot of these popes, as I stated, didn't make it very long. They were strangled, killed, dropped dead of heart attacks and strokes and things like that. A lot of popes didn't make it very long. They died maliciously. So I think when I'm looking back at this in a reflective way, I go, you know, Christ will always have to purge his church. And sometimes he has to do it by dealing with evil rulers and evil spiritual, so-called spiritual leaders. And I look at this situation and I go, how did the church make it? The church should have fallen and went into straight apostasy and lost all of its footing. But it didn't. It remains. It remains as we see it. And honestly, I mean, I'm not saying that The See of Rome is really great and everything in it is great right now, but we don't see this madness. It is definitely, in fact, it's probably on a bipolar opposite extreme that needs to come back to more balance, if you ask me. But this was a tragic event, really questioning any historian or spiritual insight of whether or not the church was ever spiritual during this time, or if it was just simply political ambition only. So the trial of the courts became a trial of the papacy itself, if you look at it from one angle. Should the papacy remain? Was it ever valid to begin with? So here's my thought. Through this trial and synod, I think when you look at Stephen VI, who sought to change the past, but it ended up leading him to be condemned by the past, we need to be careful not to do the same thing. What I mean by that is this simply. The past has ugly places, things we want to remove, things we want to just unbury and accuse and attack and say, that's despicable. Let's try to erase our history. But that's only going to destroy us later. It's not going to help. You're not removing anything. You're only bringing greater condemnation and error to yourself when you do things like that. So I wouldn't recommend trying to change the past or unbury it and put it on trial and accuse it of all these things. Rather, learn from it. That's what we do. We learn from the success and failure of things that have been done in the past in front of us, around us. And what we do is we learn both the good and the evil so that we mimic the good and replace the evil and make sure not to repeat it in that process. So that would be my view of all this. That's how I view the Cadaver Synod, is that it is a lesson in history for us, that Christ will continue to build his church and the gates of hell will not prevail, even when nonsensical stupidity comes from its leaders, and that men are evil and that men do take spiritual positions and create evil in it, but God will not be mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, that also shall he reap, and that Christ will still perform and produce spiritual leaders from evil times. And we see where he did that. So there's a couple sources that I would recommend for you to read on this. I mentioned William Monroe. He wrote on this in 2022, A New Look at the Cadaver Synod. Michael Edward Moore as well, The Body of Pope Formosus. I think he wrote that in maybe 2010, somewhere in there. I would recommend writings like that. These are good works. These are things that you can learn more about it because they are very interesting. So hopefully you learned something today. I see in the audience a question had come in. I'll make sure to take that. Hercule, thank you for the contribution here. What is the difference with the councils declaring heretics that are deceased? Seems like we can declare dead ones' ideas bad. Leo, really the 14th at least, said he didn't want to comment on the politics after the storm he caused. Yeah, so great question. Doctrines can be condemned. And by the way, I will actually go so far as to say that there's a lot of inconsistencies with this. Now, what was not condemned was condemning people who were dead or their positions. What was condemned by Theodore II in this synod was bringing a dead corpse to trial. So people could still be condemned after their death, and so could their doctrines. What was put in place in John and others that came into papacy said, no more of that. That's not going to happen. So Theodore II kind of reinstates things and tries to undo it. And then later, John, I believe the 9th, came in and said, listen, we're never doing that again. It wasn't condemning the dead or condemning their actions and beliefs or even their person as much as you take their body out of its resting place, put them on trial, like what we saw with Stephen VI. So that needs to be clarified as well. I will also say that there's some controversy in this, that men who have been condemned in the past are now being venerated through Eastern customs. So Rome has condemned the Eastern beliefs, but since having brought into communion some of the Eastern regions, some of the patron saints have come with Eastern rite, who have now come into communion with Rome. And by bringing Eastern rite into Roman rite, into communion, what once was condemned then have now been received, that were in the sainthood in the East, but condemned in the West, have now been brought into some sort of communion. Explain that. There's some controversy and fun debates there. In fact, Michael Lofton has done some interesting commentary on that. Make sure you go check out his channel and see some of the interesting things that are there. But thank you for that super chat. For those that are listening for the first time, thanks for joining this episode of Facts. Hopefully you learned some fun facts about history. Facts is an acronym. It stands for Fathers, Apocrypha, Canon, Text, and Scripture. We talk anything about that. If this is your first time, hit that like button on this video. Also hit the subscribe. If you're on the podcast, as I stated earlier, hit follow so you get the notifications when these come. If you would like to partner with us, many of you have done that by giving a one-time donation or a monthly donation. We'd love to have that support as we continue to build the program and create a website, along with other things like trying to get merchandise to you guys that you've been asking for it. There's a link in the description here where you can give that gift one time or over a long period of time, every month or something like that. Even a small amount goes a long way as we continue to build this podcast and speak in public places and go to different places, speak at churches on a regular basis. We'd love to continue to do things like that. Anything you do to help us goes a long way. All right, folks, that's all that we have time for today. Thank you for joining this episode. And as always, grace and peace to you. God bless.